Late December 1881, Ashland, Kentucky was a small but growing Ohio River town preparing for Christmas. Homes in the eastern Kentucky port, population about 3,400, were decorated for the holiday. Steamboats traveled up and down the busy Ohio and nearby big sandy rivers. Horses and buggies trotted along the unpaved streets and roads, and families looked forward to getting together. It seemed destined to be an idyllic celebration.
But that peace would be shattered on December 23rd. Here's what the Ashland Independent newspaper reported in 1883.
The crimes are so hideous in all their details of black deeds that it would probably be impossible to find their parallel. How human beings could conceive, plan, and carry into effect such horrible designs upon the innocent, the pure, and the virtuous is something that is past the comprehension of man in finding out. Humanity shudders at the thought of them, and nature closes its eyes upon the revealing scene with instinctive fear and sorrow.
By Christmas Eve morning, the town was no longer buzzing with holiday joy, but with the horrifying news of a triple homicide, rape, and arson case. The community was shocked, and headlines were captured across the country with what became known as the Ashland Tragedy. Welcome to Kentucky Case Files. I'm Emily Steele.
And I'm Marcus Rowland, and this is the Ashland Tragedy Case, Part 1, Bloody Christmas.
Before we get to that terrible Christmas Eve, it's worth taking a moment to understand the community where all of this happened.
Historian Joe Castle is the author of The Ashland Tragedy, Murder, a Mob, and a Militia in Kentucky, the definitive work on the Ashland Tragedy. It expands on a booklet written by contemporary newspaper editor J.M. Hoff, who covered the story as it unfolded. Castle says the Ashland of 1881 was a town on the rise.
Everything was growing. It was a very, I guess you might say, religious community. There were a lot of churches. It was right there on the river, and the riverbank was a good place for people to go and picnic and just sort of have get-togethers and things like that. Watch the boats go by. But the limits of the town were spreading out. It was a nice place to be, and there was a lot of work. All the iron mills, there was plenty places for guys to work, and they did. They worked. And there was different ethnic groups that lived there, different races of people, and they all seemed to get along, more than most, I guess. It was a peaceful, peaceable place to be, for the most part.
It was a close-knit community where the Ohio River was part of everyday life. Kentucky still had a frontier quality to it, but it felt safe. The Gibbons family lived in a small 1.5-story home, partly owned by a local merchant, C.C. Geiger, located near the intersection of what is now 28th Street and Carter Avenue, in the part of Ashland then known as Geiger's Addition, Geigerville, or East Ashland. There is nothing particularly noteworthy about the family. They weren't wealthy or politically connected in the typical ways that could make someone a target. There was no reason to believe their names would ever appear in newspapers across the country. J.W. John Gibbons, a carpenter, and his wife Martha had been married about 26 years. In 1881, he was 68 and she was 48. Their marriage had been rocky, but they had produced 8 children. Still at home were 17-year-old Robert, who had lost his leg in a railroad accident, 14-year-old daughter Fannie, and an 11-year-old son named Sterling. The couple had 3 married daughters who lived in Ohio. There was an older son, William, who Castle described as a mystery. Not much is known about him. The Gibbonses also had lost a 5-year-old son, Harry, about a year earlier. Fannie was said to be a pretty girl who had matured early and had, quote, winning manners that made her very popular in a large circle of friends. 17-year-old son Robert, or Robbie as he was called, was described as an industrious young man who worked as a nail feeder at the Norton Iron Works, the same workplace where he had lost his leg when he fell in the path of an empty railroad car. According to reports, Robbie, not his father, was the primary breadwinner for the family.
Around noon, Friday, December 23rd, 1881, Martha and her youngest child, Sterling, boarded a buggy to Ironton, Ohio, just 5 or so miles north of Ashland, where they would stay with Kate, one of Martha's married daughters. The plan was to do some shopping on Christmas Eve and then return later that night. Robbie and Fannie would be left alone because their father, John, was away working in West Virginia and had been for several weeks. Before they left, Martha asked one of her neighbors, Carolyn Thomas, if she would allow her daughter Emma to spend the night. Emma, who was also known as Emma Carrico, was Fannie's best friend and said to be fine-looking, well-developed, and loved by everyone who knew her. Her presence would help keep the kids company and give Martha a bit of comfort knowing they weren't alone. Carolyn agreed and sent Emma next door. Here's a reading from the Ashland Independent's recap of the case from 1883.
That night, the neighbors heard the singing, merry laughter of the young ladies and boy, and enjoyed their happiness. And they were merry. 'Twas Christmas time, a season when all that is not pure and good should fly from the heart, and bright visions of happy days to come should drive gloom and sorrow from man's mind and soul.
According to reports at the time, Caroline Thomas awoke around 4:30 in the morning on Christmas Eve, 1881. Looking toward the neighboring Gibbons home, everything appeared quiet. But then something caught her attention. At first, she assumed it was the glow of a lamp inside the Gibbons house, but within moments she realized it wasn't lamplight at all. The house was on fire.
She immediately ran toward the house screaming fire, hoping someone inside would hear her. When she reached the front door, it was locked. As she continued calling for help, neighbors rushed over carrying buckets of water, blankets, and anything they thought might help save the family or put the fire out.
As you can imagine, Caroline was frantic. She repeatedly yelled for her daughter. Once the neighbors realized children were trapped inside the burning house, several men forced their way in, despite the smoke and flames. Joe Arthur broke a window and immediately saw a hand protruding from the darkness. It was Emma. They pulled her out and laid her outside. Another volunteer found Fannie lying on a bed. Others located Robert. One by one, the children were carried from the house, while neighbors continued battling the fire.
It quickly became obvious that none of the children was alive. Their bodies had been badly burned and were virtually unrecognizable. Carolyn Thomas, watching her daughter and the Gibbons children carried from the home, was overwhelmed with grief, according to reports.
As daylight broke and the fire was extinguished, townspeople began noticing details the darkness had hidden. Despite the destruction, they could see that there was blood on the bedsheets and throughout the parts of the house still standing. And much worse, they realized each of the children's skulls had suffered devastating blunt force injuries. Then investigators discovered an axe and a crowbar, both stained with blood and matted with hair. An overturned coal oil can was nearby. A realization dawned on them. The children had not died in the fire. The blaze was not an accident. It had been set to conceal 3 grisly murders.
3 local physicians examined the victims and reached the same disturbing conclusion. Robert, Fannie, and Emma had all died from violent attacks before the fire ever began. And both girls had been raped or outraged, as reports termed it at the time. The horror of the crime stunned Ashland. What had first appeared to be a tragic house fire had become something far darker.
With the local officials lacking experience investigating a crime of this magnitude, Ashland's civic leaders called an emergency citizens meeting on December 26th, the same day as the children's funeral and burial in the Ashland Cemetery. A 3-man citizens committee was appointed, consisting of banker Abe C. Campbell, Civil War veteran and merchant John Calder, and Norton Iron Works president John Russell. Their mission was straightforward: find someone capable of solving one of the most shocking crimes Kentucky had ever witnessed. Law enforcement and investigative criminal procedures in the 1800s were certainly not like they are today. There were no forensic experts, certainly no DNA testing, and autopsies were not standardized, often performed by regular physicians in makeshift morgues, quite often in homes. and local law enforcement were not trained. As a result, private detectives were often brought in to do the difficult work.
The Ashland Citizens Committee hired a detective of some renown, John T. Norris of Springfield, Ohio, who arrived in Ashland promising not to settle on a theory until every fact had been examined. That promise wouldn't last. Here's historian Joe Castle.
John Norris was a detective from up in Ohio, and he had a good reputation. And see, the local authorities at the time, there were constables in Ashland, and there was a sheriff, but they weren't equipped to investigate murders like this. They just didn't have the ability or the know-how, really. So, and it was common practice, basically, for times like these, to hire the seasoned detectives to come and work the case because they had more experience and more knowledge about things like that. Fingerprinting wasn't a thing until around the turn of the century, I think. But John Norris came down right away. In fact, he started his investigation, I think, the day of the funeral. Of course, people were calling for a quick solution to the case, find the perpetrators, and get this thing solved.
Another investigator, Alf Burnett from Charleston, West Virginia, also traveled to Ashland hoping to solve the crime. Although the committee never officially hired him, Burnett inserted himself into the investigation, a decision that would eventually create problems of its own. But that's a story for later. The murders left Ashland in shock. This wasn't simply another crime. It was something the town had never experienced. The question on everyone's mind was simple. Who could have done this?
One of the first people Norris interviewed was Martha Gibbons, the children's mother, who was still reeling from the loss of her family. Exactly what she told him has been debated ever since, but after speaking with her and despite his promise not to rush to judgment, Norris became convinced he had already identified the killer. Not a stranger, not a drifter. He believed the murderer was the children's own father, John Gibbons.
It was a sensational theory. At the time of the crime, John Gibbons had been out of town since Thanksgiving. His whereabouts were unknown, which apparently wasn't uncommon for him. He hadn't even shown up for his children's funeral. But according to Norris, Gibbons had already come home. He had arrived at the house the night of December 23rd, got in bed, mistook teenager Emma for his wife Martha in the darkness, and had sexual intercourse with her. Apparently, Norris argued that after John realized what he had done, he started killing. Then he fled and killed himself, thus explaining his absence. Perhaps most controversially, Norris rejected the conclusions of the 3 physicians who had examined the bodies. The doctors agreed that the 2 girls had been raped, but despite his theory about John mistaking Emma for Martha and having sex with her, Norris insisted there had been no rapes. Instead, he argued that the injuries had been inflicted after death to mislead investigators and make it appear a sexual assault had occurred.
Already the Norris theory had holes in it, but whether because of his esteemed reputation or simply because people desperately wanted answers, newspapers seized on his conclusions almost immediately. The Associated Press was founded in 1846, making it easy in 1881 for important stories to hit newsstands nationwide. Also during that time, newspapers weren't just objectively reporting facts. They were often editorializing and sensationalizing in a tabloid style that would come to be known as yellow journalism. Virtually overnight, John Gibbons became one of the most wanted and most despised men in America. He was being portrayed by papers across the country as a monster who had slaughtered his own children. Reporters wrote that according to Martha, John had once threatened he would cut his family members' heads off with an axe. He had often talked of suicide and of burning the house down. The nearby Cincinnati Enquirer, in particular, proclaimed Gibbons as the murderer, spreading tales of his reckless living, which often left his family destitute. Here's a reading from the Enquirer's report at the time.
Old man Gibbons, the father of 2 of the murdered children, was absent from home at the time of the murder and had been for several weeks. He did not return to attend the funeral of the victims, and as time passed with no word from him, inquiry was made as to his domestic relations. It was learned that they had been extremely unpleasant, and a number of reports coming out all of which tended to point toward the old man's guilt. It became the belief of many that he had returned home in the night, committed the murder in a fit of insanity, escaped, and probably afterward committed suicide.
Castle, the historian, noted that the articles dug into every rumor they could find about his personal life.
But not everyone accepted Norris's theory. In nearby Louisa, the police arrested a black man named Willis Hockerty, who had gotten drunk and was talking about the killings of the white children, but he was soon released. One lawman in particular believed investigators were chasing the wrong guy. His name was Deputy U.S. Marshal James Heflin from Maysville, Kentucky, and before long he would completely dismantle the case against John Gibbons. Here's Castle's description of Heflin.
But now Marshal Heflin, he was, I guess, the Marshal Dillon of the time. He did good things, and the people liked him. And he was actually from Maysville, Kentucky. He was a marshal up there, which is quite a way from Ashland, actually. But he would work in different areas of eastern Kentucky, and he found himself in a lot of dangerous situations, actually. But he didn't follow Norris's theory at all, because he believed there was more than one perpetrator because of the axe and the crowbar.
Heflin had spent years as Maysville's town marshal and had earned a reputation as a relentless lawman. When he arrived in Ashland, he met with the Citizens Committee and didn't mince words. He told them he believed Norris was chasing the wrong suspect. Heflin trusted the conclusions reached by the physicians who examined the victims.
There was something else that bothered Heflin. Investigators had recovered both an axe and a crowbar, each bearing blood and hair. To Heflin, the use of multiple weapons suggested something Norris's theory failed to explain. It looked like the work of more than one man.
Rather than continuing speculating, Heflin decided to answer the most important question first. Where was John Gibbons? If Gibbons wasn't in Ashland that night, the entire theory collapsed. Heflin had been told that Gibbons often went to West Virginia for work and had family there. So Heflin got on a train and headed east.
His first stop was Huntington, West Virginia. There, people familiar with Gibbons confirmed they had seen him in the area around the time of the killings. But Heflin kept digging. His investigation eventually led him deeper into the mountains to Hamlin, West Virginia. There he found a man named Andrew Hager, who would change everything.
Hager told Heflin that Gibbons had been living and working with him for about 2 weeks before the killings. Even more significant, Hager explained that the community only received mail once a week. The news of the Ashland tragedy hadn't reached them until days after the crime. According to Hager, Gibbons had no idea his children had been killed. He couldn't have killed the kids and then fled Ashland because he had not been there for over a month.
Heflin didn't stop with one witness. He gathered sworn affidavits from people who placed Gibbons in West Virginia during the murders. Then he asked Gibbons to return with him to Ashland so the evidence could be presented publicly. It was a risky decision because by now newspapers had made Gibbons into the villain.
When the affidavits were presented, the evidence was overwhelming. John Gibbons had an alibi. He could not have committed the murders. Almost overnight, Gibbons was no longer a suspect and the investigation had to be reset. Although Gibbons had now been publicly cleared, the damage to his reputation could never truly be undone. Across the country, the media had already declared him guilty, and because news moved much slower then, many of the stories would continue circulating even after investigators admitted they had been wrong.
Ashland Mayor John Means quickly called another citizens' meeting. This time, he urged residents to set aside rumors and focus on facts. If anyone knew anything, no matter how insignificant it seemed, they were encouraged to report it to the Citizens Committee. A reward of $200, that's over $6,000 today, was initially offered, then increased to $1,000, which is more than $32,000 today. Some accounts suggest it went as high as $3,000, a whopping $100,000 today. But within days, a seemingly ordinary conversation inside a small Ashland store would crack the case wide open.
A man named George Ellis walked into a small general store in Ashland on January 2nd, 10 days after the crime, to buy a cigar. The shopkeeper made casual conversation, mentioning that John Gibbons had been cleared of the killings. Then he asked Ellis who he thought might have done it. It was an ordinary question, but Ellis's reaction was suspicious.
Ellis became visibly shaken, according to those who witnessed it. He turned pale, appeared extremely nervous, and mentioned that he and his wife, as well as 2 others, knew something about what had happened. He also said something about the others, quote, turning state's evidence. It wasn't the first time people had noticed his strange behavior. Others had remarked that Ellis seemed unusually anxious whenever the killings came up in conversation. Those observations soon made their way to Heflin. He needed to talk to this guy.
Ellis was brought to the hotel where the Citizens Committee had established its headquarters. At first, it was simply an interview, but before long, it became a confession. Here's the Ashland Independent.
Here he at once told the whole story of that hellish night's work, of how the young ladies implored for mercy, and how the heartless wretches went on with their work. A work that would have made the devils themselves shrink at the sight of.
George Ellis admitted he had been present the night Robbie, Fannie, and Emma were killed. Then he dropped another bombshell. He hadn't been there alone. He identified 2 other young men, Ellis Craft and William Neal.
According to George Ellis, the murders had been planned. He claimed that Craft and Neal had targeted the girls and forced him to accompany them to the Gibbons house for some fun, in Craft's words. Ellis insisted he never intended to participate, but had been forced at gunpoint to go. He said he had been terrified throughout the ordeal, but he admitted to helping destroy the evidence. He confessed that after the killings were over, he was ordered to retrieve coal oil and help set the house on fire to erase evidence of the crime.
Ellis also explained why he had finally come forward. He told investigators he couldn't live with what had happened, couldn't sleep, he couldn't eat. The guilt was consuming him. He also feared one of the others might eventually confess first and strike a deal for leniency. He wanted everyone involved to face justice.
As Ellis continued, every word was written down by the committee. Meanwhile, Heflin left to locate the 2 men Ellis had named. One by one, Craft and Neal were brought to the hotel. One of the questions that lingers is why George Ellis became involved with Neal and Craft in the first place. Was he a willing participant, or was he caught up in something much bigger than himself?
Historian Joe Castle believes Ellis was simply the weakest member of the group.
George Ellis was just a patsy, basically. He was just a patsy. And I didn't mention this in the book, but I found out that those 2 fellows had covered for him at work at different times because his work wasn't up to par where they were making bricks. And maybe there have been a couple of times when he showed up late for work and they covered for him. So he kind of felt obligated to them in a way. But he wasn't that type of person. And so they took advantage of him. He was young married man, but didn't have any children. But he did have a young wife.
If Castle is right, Ellis wasn't the mastermind. He was a young laborer about 26 who felt indebted to 2 slightly older co-workers who had helped him at the brickyard. And allegedly, being forced at gunpoint didn't help matters. That doesn't absolve him of responsibility, but it does paint a different picture than the one many people had at the time.
Ellis repeated the same story in front of both of the men he was fingering for the crime. His confessions weren't vague. He described locations, weapons, the sequence of events, and the roles each man played. Some were details investigators had not publicly released. Those details would later become critical during the trials. And there had already been suspicious behavior from Craft and Neal that seemed to support Ellis's confessions. Neal told at least one person he feared being suspected of the crime and was afraid it might not be safe to remain in Ashland. Craft, who was identified as a driver of one of the victims' funeral carriage, was said to have, quote, trembled like a leaf when he helped the undertaker lay out the bodies. All 3 men were arrested and housed rather unwisely together in the Boyd County Jail. When George Ellis emerged, he had changed his story. Suddenly, Kraft and Neal were innocent. He claimed he didn't know why he had confessed. Many investigators thought at the time that Ellis had been intimidated while confined with the very men he had accused. Others believed he might have been insane.
Realizing the danger, authorities quickly removed Ellis to nearby Greenup County.
All of this is a classic, what we teach in political science is the prisoner's dilemma, where when there are more than one individual who commit the crime together, they recognize that their optimal strategy is to all stay silent and not confess to the crime. Hence the graveyard meeting the next day to swear an oath, where they're getting Ellis, the weak link, to swear an oath, right? Because even though each of them recognizes that if they all stay silent, they'll all get away with it. But then each also recognizes that if one of the others is the one to confess, they will get a lighter sentence, and the ones who didn't confess will be treated more harshly. And so there is this tension where they know that the optimal outcome is that they all should stonewall any accusations and refuse to confess. They also can't guarantee that their Confederates will do so. And so there's this great temptation to defect and be the one who confesses first, essentially. So we know this. It's like you could just teach this out of a textbook, basically. Seeing this play out is what we call a prisoner's dilemma.
Rumors of lynching began spreading almost immediately, and Ashland civic leaders started trying to thwart the violence. The Citizens Committee understood that if a mob seized the prisoners, the truth of the crimes might never be fully known. More important, the town's reputation would be forever stained. They wanted convictions, not vengeance. But newspapers helped inflame those passions. Some stories openly suggested the accused deserved swift punishment before trial. For many readers in 1881, the printed word carried enormous authority. If a newspaper hinted that hanging the prisoners would be justice, some people accepted that as fact.
Join us next time on Kentucky Case Files for the Ashland Tragedy Case, Part 2, Justice, Vengeance, and Vigilantism. I'm Emily Steele.
And I'm Marcus Rowland. Thanks for listening to Kentucky Case Files, and make sure you like and subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Sourcing for this podcast includes The Ashland Tragedy, Murder, Mob, and a Militia in Kentucky by Joe Castle and J.M. Huff, the Cincinnati Enquirer, the Ashland Daily Independent, and other newspapers of the period, the 1882 Adjutant General's Report, the books Murder in Old Kentucky and Military History of Kentucky, murderbygaslight.com, and the podcast Once Upon a Crime and Most Notorious.